Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much to everyone who is joining us. My name is Kashana Hill, and I serve as Executive Director of the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, which you will hear me refer to as LAFAC throughout the evening. So, again, want to say thanks and welcome to everyone who is joining us, whether you're with us virtually via Zoom or whether you're watching us on Facebook Live. This is one of LAFAC's Fair Housing Month activities. Fair Housing Month is celebrated across the country during April in recognition of the fact that the Fair Housing Act was originally signed into law in April of 1968. And so in April, advocates, lawyers, community members, and everyone who cares about the fight for fair housing continues to celebrate the spirit of the Fair Housing Act by hosting all kinds of community-based events or conversations. And so this is a time when we think about the work that has been done when it comes to achieving housing equity and the work that remains to be done. I do want to invite everyone to LAFAC's final Fair Housing Month event, which will take place tomorrow, April 27th. And it'll be an amazing conversation with tenant organizers from across the country. I want to just share a little bit about the work that LAFAC does before I introduce our guest and before she tells you a little bit about who she is. LAFAC has been in existence since 1995. We were originally the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center with a mission focused on ending housing discrimination and segregation in the Greater New Orleans area. In 2020, in recognition of our 25th anniversary and in recognition of the fact that we actually do work in community across the entire state of Louisiana, we changed our name to the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. The work that we do is focused on ending discrimination and segregation across the state. We know that where we live really has so much to do with the opportunities that we will have access to. And so it is incredibly important, and it is very clearly a racial justice issue that all families be able to choose the housing that works best for them, free from discriminatory actions and policies. And so at LAFAC, what we do is challenge discriminatory policies and practices that inhibit people's fair housing choice. We do that work through policy advocacy, through litigation, through foreclosure prevention counseling, and also through providing educational offerings to community members across the state. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had to shift our work a little bit in order to do more in the fight against eviction. Now, we've always known at the Fair Housing Action Center that evictions really are a racial justice issue. We're very clear on who is impacted by evictions and by the landlord tenant laws in the state of Louisiana that really provide no protections for tenants. It's become clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated an eviction crisis across the state. In the largest cities in Louisiana, which are New Orleans, Shreveport, and Baton Rouge, we saw that before the COVID-19 pandemic, those communities already had very high eviction rates that were higher than the national average. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, those rates have only risen and the eviction crisis has only gotten worse. And so we are engaging in policy advocacy to stop evictions across the state, to make sure that residents and renters across the state are aware of their rights when it comes to the Centers for Disease Control's eviction moratorium that has been in place since last summer. We're also providing free legal representation to people who are facing eviction in Orleans and Jefferson parishes. So I want to make sure that any folks who are joining us that they know that you can go to our website and click our COVID-19 resource page. We're at lafairhousing.org. You can find out more information about the work that we are doing as it relates to eviction defense and the COVID-19 pandemic. Our work to ensure that people can stay housed during the pandemic,
Yes.
brought us into contact with tonight's guest. And so I'm so pleased and so honored to be able to introduce to you all Arielle Butler, who is a very powerful housing advocate. We have partnered with her around some legislation that is currently at the Louisiana State Legislature. And I'm so excited to have been able to build this relationship. And I'm excited for the work that we're going to continue to do. So, with that, Ms. Butler, would you like to tell everyone a little bit about who you are?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so much, Cassandra, for having me on here and letting me share my story. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. I would not know anything about fair housing. I wouldn't know anything about the amazing, amazing work that you guys have been doing for so long. I wouldn't know anything about that until it happened in my own life. Like I said today, it can happen to any of us. This pandemic struck so many of us that we never thought we would be in these shoes that we are in now. You know, we never thought that we would be looking for a place to live. We never thought that we would be homeless. You know, we never thought these things, especially people that are at their older years of their lives. I had to look at my mother. I had to look at my mother in her eyes and see where she was beaten down, that she had nowhere to go. She didn't know what she was going to do. You know, that should not happen. Those things should not happen. You know, there should be something that we can fall back on, you know, and that's how this all started, because I looked around me, you know, while I was being evicted out of my home, you know, being evicted out of my home, this pandemic hit. And unemployment was going through like it should. Everything was happening like it should. You know, I was working at a medical office because it was a medical office. They ended up closing down. And I was also doing maintenance work on the side of that. I was cleaning churches. And it being that churches had to shut down, you know, that went away also. So I was making about $36 a week on unemployment. And with my landlord, you know, we worked something out, but I understood on their end, they have to do what they have to do as well, you know, but working things out and having open communication, that's what I'm all about. You know, and that's when the Moratorium Act came into play. I qualified for everything that came on that act. Everything that was there, I qualified for it. So I brought that to them. I showed her that. Next thing I know, they said they were looking into it. When they brought me to court, I had nothing to worry about. And when I got home for court, people were moving all of my belongings out of my home. Out of my home. They told me I had 15 minutes, everything I had out of my home with a family full of 7. So I did that. I did that. And in the process of doing that, and I won't give names because I don't do that. They wanted to be behind the scenes, but a judge, a mentor of mine that I had worked with told me to look into this Fair Housing Act, look into calling a few people. So I looked into doing that. And I shared my story. At the beginning, it was not Maxwell who I shared my story with, but it was someone who I shared my story with. And literally, guys, I literally thought that they forgot about me. You know, I felt like I had no one in the world. I was by myself. You know, so I spent 45 days with 7 people in a hotel room. And an amazing person came into our lives and gave me and my family a chance. And that's all that we asked for from the beginning, was a chance. You know, your mouth can say whatever, but your actions show so many things. And that's all I asked for. And that's what I asked my previous landlord for, was for a chance, but they couldn't give me that. They couldn't give me that. So this gentleman did. Him and his wife gave me and my family a chance, and we were able to move into a home the day before Christmas. I was able to give my son, who was autistic, and the whole reason was for us fighting to stay where we were, which was in Zachary, was so that he could be in the school district in his classes that fit with his IEP classes for his autism. So that's what made us fight so hard. So we moved into this amazing home, 3.5 acres in Zachary, Louisiana. What a blessing. What an amazing thing. And that's all we asked for, like I said. And in a matter of us moving in, I get a phone call from the fair housing, amazing people. And they tell me, so what's going on? Where are you? We heard about you and you guys, all I could do was cry. I said, you remembered me? You remembered me? How could you remember me? You know, like when I called you, I was bawling, crying. I didn't even know who I was talking to. I was in the middle of getting kicked out of a home, you know? And I remember them telling me, we'll call you back. And out of everyone, they called me back. And the next thing I know, I'm sitting in front of Congress, sharing my story. I'm at the state capitol, sharing my story about what I went through, sharing my story so that others will not go through what I went through, sharing my story so that it can be a transparent conversation between people that feel that they are below others, so that what they say is not heard. That was not true. That was not true at that time. And I can tell you that firsthand. I sat up there and I shared my story. I said, I'm not another number. I am not another number. There's 35,000 people that are, and their names are going to be right up here with me. So what are we going to do? What needs to happen? Yes, there are 10,000 people. Yes, you've heard this story 10,000 times. That's what I was told. We've heard this story 10,000 times. But you haven't heard a story like mine. And that each one of those 10,000 people have a story. So what are you going to do? What needs to happen? What needs to change so that each one of those stories don't have to happen anymore? Each one of those stories can have a happy ending like mine, because I found a home for my kids. But what about the ones that don't find a home? What about the ones that don't have a place to go? What are we going to do for them? And that was my drive. I could have stepped away and said, you know what? I got my house. I got what I needed. You know what I'm saying? What? No, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. So I am so honored and blessed to be here. And I thank you guys for letting me be here to share my story. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, we are definitely going to have a more detailed conversation. And I just heard so much, Ms. Butler, and what you shared, and just wanted to sort of pull out a couple of points. You know, you mentioned how many families, tens of thousands of folks across the state, right, are struggling with the possibility of being forced from their home. And so those are the folks that we are here to talk about tonight. And we are here to be fully cognizant of what is happening, right, when people are being forced from their homes. So we're going to do a virtual tour tonight and have a conversation of this exhibit that's been inspired by Matthew Desmond's Pulitzer Prize winning book. And it is an exhibit that brings visitors into the world of low-income renters and the evictions that happen to those folks. So we have partnered tonight with the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge, Art Flow, Capital Area Alliance for the Homeless, Foundation for Louisiana, the Housing First Alliance of the Capital Area, Aetna. We've partnered with the Office of the Mayor President of the City of Baton Rouge, Parish of East Baton Rouge, the Mid-City Redevelopment Alliance, Forum 225, and the East Baton Rouge Parish Library to present to everyone tonight the Evicted exhibition in Baton Rouge this spring. So we're going to see highlights from the exhibit that is currently in Baton Rouge. Rather than taking everybody there and sort of walking around, what we are going to do is present highlights from the exhibit. You'll see short clips tonight narrated by Facts Policy Analyst, Carlay Wilson. And we're going to present the videos in 4 brief sections. And then Ms. Butler and I will have conversations after each of those sections. We do want to encourage you all to please share your thoughts and questions in the chat. We will be able to answer your questions. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen or the chat if you want to share questions. I did want to note that the exhibit is sponsored by a generous grant from the Avangrid Foundation. It's also organized by the National Building Museum, where it was made possible by gifts from Amy Falls, Ford Foundation, and the Wells Fargo Foundation. So we hope that tonight will inspire everyone to actually want to check out the full exhibit. Free tickets are available by reservations, and the COVID precautions that are in place will be observed. If you'd like to get a free ticket for the exhibit, you can visit artsbr.org. That's artsbr.org for more information. The exhibit is open Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. through May 28th, 2021. And it's located at the Firehouse Gallery of the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge. So with that, we are going to go ahead and play the first section of the exhibit. Again, it will be narrated by Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center's policy analyst, Carlay Wilson. And then Ms. Butler and I will be back to discuss a little bit about what we saw in the first section. Thank you.
There's a knock at the door. Whether or not the belongings are packed, the kids are ready, or the new plan is put in place, it no longer matters. The eviction has begun. It's time to leave. For a family being evicted, the event is a devastating blow, a key link in a long chain of problems. Multiplied many times over, every single day, eviction has become a national crisis. More than 3.7 million evictions are filed every year, each with a unique story of loss. Housing instability leads to problems at work and school, health issues, and community disengagement for children and families. Eviction thereby affects all of us, either directly or indirectly. Eviction used to be rare in the United States. It's now common. This is a relatively new problem over the past few decades, but it does not have to be a continuing trend. We have the tools to make a change. There's a knock at the door. It's time. Approximately 4.8 million households receive poverty-related housing assistance through programs of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. However, the majority of government spending on housing goes not to poor people, but to homeowners and high-income households through the mortgage interest deduction, capital gains exclusions, and other real estate deductions. The mortgage interest deduction alone cost the federal government $71 billion in 2015 and more than double the $29.9 billion spent on Section 8, which provides housing for low-income renters. In 2018, a full-time worker earning minimum wage could not afford to rent a 2-bedroom apartment anywhere in the country. In 2016, there were 3.7 million evictions filings in the United States. By comparison, in 2009, at the height of the housing crisis, only 1 million Americans faced foreclosure. The eviction crisis is worse and happens every year.
All right, so that was the first section of the exhibit. And so what I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about how we think about evictions in this country. And Ms. Butler, I would love to get your input here, because we know that people, as we heard in the video, really tend to blame evictions on individual moral failings, right? We think that somebody could have done something differently to avoid having this fate befall them. In fact, what we really need to understand is that evictions are the predictable result of injustices in our housing system. And so I would love to hear briefly what your
Yes.
thoughts are on some of those injustices that are present in our system of housing that does actually lead to evictions, right? What are some of the things that are wrong with our housing system that causes people to be evicted?
There's so many things that are wrong in our housing systems that cause eviction. You know, we look at how many people are in a home. We look at a race. We look at that's the number one thing that I looked at was that what color you are, what kind of past that you have. You know, one gentleman said today was that, you know, what if we judge someone on rather than being convicted of a crime? You know, what if they hadn't been convicted at all, and we'd say they can't move into a place before there was a conviction or anything? You know, we first assume things rather than know the true facts. And that happens all the time with anything. My own story was when me and my mother was looking for housing after we had been evicted, was they told us that we could move in a place that had vacancies. And let's be honest, when we walked in there, you guys, people look at how you look when you first walked in somewhere. They judge you with that first appearance. When we walked in, they were like, oh yeah, money, money, money. You know, what do they have to spend? You know, not knowing anything. And when we were talking, not knowing that we were homeless. We were homeless. We had been evicted from our home, not even 2 days prior. And she told us that we could move in there. But when we moved in, if they had found any type of eviction on our record, we would have to move out in 48 hours. We couldn't talk about anything. Our $50 application fee was to her, but we would have to be gone. No questions asked.
I don't mean to interrupt you, and I'm so sorry, but I definitely do want to, because we've got room a little further in the conversation to talk about the ways that evictions can follow people unfairly, right? We've set up a system where people who are evicted will then be punished because of that eviction for years to come. So I definitely would like to talk about that a little bit down the line, but I just wanted to pause. You know, I heard you talking about there really is a limited safety net. And I think one thing that people who have read the book Evicted, one of the things that you begin to understand, if you didn't already understand this, is that we think of evictions as a symptom of poverty, right? But in fact, what we should realize is that evictions are actually what cause poverty. And people having been evicted will work to continue to keep them trapped in these cycles. And we already don't have a lot of protections in place for people who are barely hanging on. And then if something happens, the net just falls completely out, and then they can be forced from their home. So definitely the lack of a social safety net is something that forces people into evictions. So we
don't have that. We don't have
that. You're absolutely correct. We do not have that. And it's certainly what we have is not sufficient. And so I did want to move into the second section of the exhibit. And this section will discuss who is most affected by eviction. And then we'll have a little conversation about that afterward, because I heard you getting into that as well.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Oh, that it was great, but that's coming up next.
Okay.
People of all ages, races, and ethnicities experience eviction. Any family living on the edge may need only one thing to go wrong for rent to lapse. However, eviction is more common for African American single mothers than for any other group. In general, families with children can have trouble finding new places to live as landlords are wary of renting to them. Other heavily impacted groups include poor women of color, poor single mothers of all races, and survivors of domestic violence. The cycle of being evicted, then struggling to find new housing and ending up in worse housing in more dangerous neighborhoods than before can bring families without a safety net into poverty. Being the victim of a crime is stressful under any circumstances, but many low-income renters also risk eviction if they call the police to report a crime in their home. Nuisance ordinances in many cities and states nationwide allow or even mandate eviction when the police are called to the property too often. Nuisance ordinances can make a bad situation worse by penalizing tenants.
So, I want to get now into the question about who is most impacted by evictions. So, just drawing on a little bit, what we heard in the video is that there are definitely, some issues with regard to race and evictions, right? That we just cannot ignore. I know from fair housing's perspective, we see evictions as a fair housing issue because they are so closely tied to race. And so earlier we were talking about how there are higher rates of evictions in Baton Rouge and Shreveport and in New Orleans than there are across the country, right? Now, if we drill down on those cities even further, what we know is that the neighborhoods that were redlined by the federal government, 3 generations ago, those are the communities that experience higher rates of evictions, right? Redlining and the detrimental effects, they just continue to go on and on and on and on. We know, for instance, that life expectancy is shorter in communities that were formerly redlined. We know that babies are born at low birth weights at higher rates in those communities that were formerly redlined, right? So we can take kind of all these disparate outcomes, all these unequal and unjust outcomes, and if we mapped out where those unjust outcomes are the highest, it would be in these communities of color that were redlined, 60 years ago. And so evictions are the same thing, right? And so we cannot ignore the fact that the people who are being evicted the most often, as we heard in the video, are Black women. And there is plenty of data that backs that up. In New Orleans, we have a local housing justice group, Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative, that before COVID had released data from 6 months of their court watching project. They trained community members to go into eviction court in Orleans Parish and see what was happening. And in a city that is 59% Black, more than 80% of the people who were being evicted in court were African American, right? So you would expect to see that the majority of people being evicted are Black because we live in a majority Black city here in New Orleans. But the reality was that the people being evicted, those numbers were more Black, if that makes sense, than the region of the city as a whole. We also know that Black women made up about 56% of the people who were being evicted in that 6-month period here in Orleans Parish. So again, it's very clear that this is a housing justice and a racial justice and a fair housing issue. In your experience, what are your thoughts on the racial dynamics when it comes to evictions?
Oh, goodness. My personal experience has been, goodness, it starts off with first, I'm going to be honest, transparent is key. It's not knowing, what is she? That has been a big question. Is ever since I was, in the 5th grade, I was asked, what ethnicity are you? And I have seen personally with people going inside of places, especially dealing in the last year with being evicted and having to look in all sorts of areas, you guys. I looked everywhere, all over Zachary. It didn't matter. I went outside of Zachary. No, it wasn't my key spot because of my son, because of the schooling that I wanted was in Zachary. But I went everywhere to look for a place. And I saw in every area that I went, I was treated differently. It amazed me. When I went in certain areas, I was treated a certain way. And in other certain areas, I was treated another way. Now, why is that? Why is it I'm the same person? I'm not changing, I'm not changing. What is happening that when I go in one place, I'm treated this way, in another place, I'm treating another way, So just imagine how the woman's going in with torn up pants because she has nothing to wear, or her hair tied up in a hair wrap, where we're so quickly to point out that she must not have, she might not have nothing else to wear but that, she's homeless, she has nothing, we're so quick to point that out. Imagine how she's treated when she goes in. I went, and I'm going to be honest, like I said, the day that I was served my papers, in Zachary, Louisiana, I got in my car and I showed up at the Zachary police station. And isn't it ironic? This is a true story. It's very ironic. When I pulled up at the police station, another woman pulled up at the police station. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Another woman pulled up at the police station right behind me and was going through the exact same thing that I was going through. The exact same thing I was going through. She was being evicted. She had, like I said, I'm being honest. I was dressed up because I had a previous engagement, but she had been in her bed. She had threw on a shirt. She had threw on what she had to wear, but I
Uh-oh, so I think we have lost Miss Butler. So what we're gonna do is just, we'll come back to this question and keep the conversation going. But what we'll do now is just move on ahead to the next section of our video. And we are going to see in this section from the exhibit, a little information around evictions and the court process.
Housing court, also known as rental court or landlord-tenant court, is a processing factory. Judges gavel through cases over and over again all day with little time to consider individual circumstances. In most jurisdictions across the country, court-ordered evictions happen every working day. The court system can be complicated. Most landlords are represented by counsel, while most tenants are not. Landlords who have paid for attorneys and gone through a sometimes arduous process to gather paperwork and wait the requested amount of time almost always have the upper hand. In fact, often tenants do not even show up to court because they cannot get the time off work or because they see no benefit to their appearance. An eviction may then be issued by default judgment.
So I would guess that many people who are joining us today are sort of aware of the benefits of having a lawyer when you go to tenant court as a renter. But we know that there are so many ways in which tenants are disadvantaged when it comes to the court system and evictions. Firstly, we have to understand that when we're talking about, the numbers of people who are evicted, that really only captures people who have gone through the court process. We know that there are a significant number of renters who will do what's called self-evicting when they first receive a notice from a landlord saying, you violated your lease or you haven't paid your rent. Those folks will choose to move out on their own rather than having an eviction filed against them, or rather than having to go into court. We also know that particularly in Louisiana, and I would guess in many places that you all may be from, informal and illegal evictions are very, very common. We saw many informal and illegal evictions in Louisiana before the COVID-19 pandemic and have continued to see them since the pandemic has begun. And when we talk about illegal evictions or informal evictions, we're talking about those evictions that take place outside of the court system. So we might see landlords do things like just change the locks so that a tenant can't get back into their home. We might see landlords turn off the utilities, right, to try and force a tenant to move. They make it so uncomfortable, without air conditioning or running water, that the tenant would just go ahead and move. Now, those things are totally illegal because in order to be legal, right, an eviction has to go through the actual court process. But in a place like Louisiana, where there are no tenant protections and where our landlord tenant laws are just skewed to give all of the power to the landlord, some landlords really don't care if they are illegally evicting someone, because what recourse will that low income tenant who doesn't have access to a lawyer have, right? And these are the calculations that landlords are making when they decide to illegally evict someone outside of the court system. We know that tenants who do go into court are incredibly likely to lose their eviction case if they don't have access to a lawyer. But when they do, we know that the success rate for a tenant in eviction court goes up to something like 80%, right? They are so much more likely to be able to remain in their home if they do have access to a lawyer. I also want to say that in Louisiana, we know that the people that we work with, and this includes elected officials, they continue to be shocked about how easily and how quickly an eviction can happen. We're not talking about something that requires, a 60-day or 30-day or 90-day notice. In Louisiana, tenants can be evicted with as little as, 5 to 10 days notice. I also think it's important for us to be clear about the fact that in Louisiana, tenancies roll over to a month-to-month basis once a written lease term ends. So if a tenant and a landlord sign a 1-year lease and that 1-year lease ends, if they haven't signed another written lease for another set period of time, then what happens is the tenancy then rolls over to what's called a month-to-month tenancy. And so there is no additional lease term, and the tenant is able to remain in their home on a monthly basis. And I would say the majority of tenants at this point in the COVID-19 pandemic are now on month-to-month tenancies. And so one way landlords can get around even going to court to evict a tenant is that if there is a month-to-month tenancy, 10 days before the end of the month, all they have to do is let the tenant know that their month-to-month lease will not be renewed. In Louisiana, we only require 10 days notice if a tenant is on a month-to-month lease. So if it's April 20th and your landlord wants you to be out so that somebody else can move in on May 1st, they just have to give you that notice on April 20th saying, at the end of the month, your tenancy has ended, and then you're done. So you've got 10 days before the end of the month to get out. And that's actually perfectly legal. And that's what our system in Louisiana provides for. So with that fuller understanding of the court system, and again, I know there are so many different points that we haven't even raised. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat and we can discuss them. But we're going to move on to the next exhibit section and take a look at the current impact of evictions in Louisiana during the COVID-19 pandemic.
A stable place to call home is one of the strongest predictors of success for families. Study after study shows affordable, long-term housing options have lifelong economic benefits for communities and families. Still, Baton Rouge has one of the highest eviction rates in the United States, with roughly 9 families experiencing eviction every day. When we look into the data, we begin to uncover why. Louisiana renters have fewer rights and protections than almost any other state in the country. In East Baton Rouge Parish, a renter must make $17.19 per hour to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment, but the minimum wage in Louisiana has remained pegged at $7.25 for years. We hope you pause to wonder, what is the experience of the 4,492 families that experience eviction in East Baton Rouge Parish every year? What are the lifelong impacts, and how is that changing the face of our community? And perhaps most important of all, how can I make a difference?
All right. So we don't yet have Ms. Butler back. I know that she's experiencing some technical difficulties, and so we'll just keep going. But to that question about how everyone can make a difference, I hope you're thinking about that, and we are definitely going to discuss that. I did just want to give a little more context to the current impact of evictions in Louisiana. We know that more than 200,000 families in Louisiana have been evicted or are immediately at risk of eviction during the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the Centers for Disease Control's moratorium on eviction, many people are still being evicted across the state. There are many reasons for how and why that is happening, and I'll just share a few. One is that the moratorium does not stop all evictions, and that is frankly never what it was intended to do. The moratorium on evictions only stops evictions that are because of non-payment of rent, right? So there's still a whole large universe out there of other reasons why people can be evicted during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then once we look at the evictions that the moratorium is designed to stop, those evictions that are based on non-payment of rent, we know that the moratorium isn't even stopping all of those. Firstly, the moratorium doesn't just automatically apply to any tenant who can't pay their rent during the pandemic. In order to be protected by the CDC eviction moratorium, renters actually have to submit paperwork. They have to fill out a form stating that they are unable to pay their rent during the pandemic. And then they have to get that form to their landlord. They have to hope that their landlord won't refuse to accept the form, which is not legal. That's not a thing, but it's certainly something that we've seen landlords continue to do across the state. And they don't want to be able they don't want to not be able to evict their tenants for non-payment of rent. And so some landlords will just refuse to accept the form. I am an actual lawyer, and I have had a landlord hang up on me. I was representing a tenant and had a landlord tell me that she was just not going to talk to me and not going to accept the form. Even when she came to eviction court and I tried to present her with the form so that she understood that this tenant could not be evicted per the moratorium, she refused to take it from me in court. And I had to ask the judge to make her accept the form. And so if this is happening when somebody actually has an attorney, imagine what is happening to renters all across the country, all across the state, who have obstinate landlords who just refuse to believe that the moratorium is going to apply to them. And they're going to do everything in their power to ensure that they can still continue to evict all the renters that they want to evict, right? And so we need to understand that the moratorium doesn't automatically protect tenants who can't pay their rent. Tenants have to fill out a form. They have to give it to their landlord. They may have to fight to get their landlord to accept that form. Then the tenant's going to have to go to court if the landlord still wants to proceed and hope that a judge knows about the moratorium. They have to hope that a judge agrees with the moratorium. We see the moratorium being applied unevenly in courts all across the state. And so we know that people are still being evicted despite the CDC's moratorium on evictions during the pandemic. And the collateral damage to those people who are evicted is going to last for years. As we heard Ms. Butler say, so many landlords will refuse to even rent to someone who has ever even had an eviction filed against them. No matter if the eviction was dismissed, or no matter if the tenant was actually successful in their court fight and they won, we know that landlords often refuse to rent to anyone who has had an eviction filed against them. And so we need to think about, do we want to be the kind of state where we think it's cool that people who have been kicked out of their home through no fault of their own, because they're struggling through this once in a lifetime event that none of us have ever lived. They're struggling because their jobs are closed, they've lost income, they literally don't have the money to pay rent, and then they're kicked out of their home. Do we want to be the kind of state that's going to allow them to continue to be punished because they were evicted during this global pandemic? And I absolutely do not want to live in that kind of state. Right now, we are that kind of state that is going to continue to allow people to be punished because of the COVID-19 pandemic and because they have lost jobs, because they have lost income through no fault of their own. And so if we're going to change, and if we're going to be the kind of state that protects people who have been evicted as a result of this pandemic, and if we want to be the kind of state where we make sure that no one continues to be punished and that no one's eviction record will follow them for years, there are ways that you can get involved. I do want to say that you can get involved in LaFac's policy advocacy work by signing up for action alerts, following us on social media, telling your story, donating, and we also have a specific action for you to take tonight. You're going to see posted in the chat a link, and this link will allow you to send an email to your House member, your state House member, asking them to support House Bill 374. House Bill 374 would provide accurate information to landlords and renters and ensure that families have a fair chance at finding a new home after an eviction related to the pandemic or a hurricane. Please, please, please click the link and send the email today. We have been working hand in hand with Ms. Butler to ensure that families like hers will not be blacklisted from homes and jobs for years to come because of an eviction record during COVID or a hurricane. We heard Ms. Butler tell us how worried she is that her family will be blacklisted from homes and jobs for years to come because she was kicked out of her home during the COVID-19 pandemic. Part of the problem here is that our current credit reporting system is broken and it's inaccurate. When a landlord or an employer runs your credit, they often just receive a report that has very little information. The report instead will just have a thumbs up or a thumbs down in terms of your ability to rent a new home. An eviction like the one that Ms. Butler was put through might trigger a thumbs down. But the report doesn't have enough information to let a renter know or to let a landlord know that the eviction occurred during COVID. It won't let a landlord know that someone like Ms. Butler tried to make partial payments. And the report also wouldn't let a landlord know that an eviction was due to Congress letting people's unemployment payments lapse. Right? All the landlord is going to get is something with a thumbs down saying this person has an eviction in their background. But it doesn't explain the totality of the situation. And those reports certainly don't recognize the humanity behind the people who were forced out of their homes. Similarly, credit reporting agencies are not required to report the results of an eviction case. So as I mentioned earlier, we know that people get denied for eviction records even when the eviction was dismissed. So all of these reasons and everything you heard from Ms. Butler, that's why the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center has helped to craft a bill in the state legislature, House Bill 374, that would address some of these issues. I'll tell you briefly what the bill will do, because I know I have been talking for a very long time. And unless and until anyone asks any questions, I could keep talking, but I'll tell you a little bit more about the bill, and then I'll wrap it up. So the bill will allow families to submit a hardship statement to consumer reporting agencies sharing how their eviction was a result of the pandemic or a hurricane. That statement has to be delivered with any report to a landlord in order to offer context. And I would also say in order to recognize humanity behind these renters that we're talking about. HB 374 will improve accuracy for renters and landlords by requiring credit reporting agencies to report the results of eviction cases, so that when a case is dismissed or that when a tenant actually won their eviction case, it shows up that way. HB 374 will ensure that landlords who charge an application fee have to disclose what their screening criteria is before a renter pays their money and they don't ever get it back. Folks need to know if they're going to be denied, maybe they would choose not to pay a $75 or $45 or $100 application fee, right? And so this bill is going to ensure that landlords share what their screening criteria is so that tenants can make the best decision for them. If they know they're going to be denied, they can save their money and not apply for that rental unit. HB 374 has support from renters and landlords, as well as children's advocates and public health associations. And that support, plus Ms. Butler's amazing testimony, is what helped get the bill out of committee earlier today. So that's a huge, important result, but there is still so much work to be done. We only have 7 weeks to pass this bill during this state session. We already know that big landlord groups and credit reporting agencies don't like this bill. They're coming for it. They are opposing the bill. And so the bill is going to need all of us to help it get off of the House floor. We are asking you to take our quick one-click action. The link has been posted in the chat. This will send an email to your legislator, and then we're asking that you share this link and this action with others. Please feel free to add your own personal touch to the message that you'll see when you click the link. If you or someone that you know has missed any rental payments during the pandemic, or if they've been at risk of eviction, it might be helpful to mention that in the email that you'll send. You can also reference that you saw the Evicted exhibit at the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge, or you heard Ms. Butler speak, or you saw her story in The Advocate. I want to say thank you so much in advance for taking the action. I hope you know that your short email could help tens of thousands of families across the state. So thank you again for attending tonight and for taking action. We hope that you'll stay tuned for future action alerts, and also like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and visit lafairhousing.org for more information. You can find lots of information about everything we've discussed tonight on our website. Click the COVID-19 resource button and you can find, for instance, that form that renters can fill out, they have to fill out and submit to their landlord in order to be protected by the CDC's eviction moratorium. Another reminder that we are hosting our final Fair Housing Month event, which will be a panel featuring tenant organizers from across the country tomorrow night on Zoom. And we'll also put the registration link in the chat so that you can feel free to sign up if you haven't already. Lastly, I want to remind you that Give NOLA Day is next week. Any support that you give will directly support LaFac's fight against evictions. You can schedule your donation now at www.givenola.org/Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. And that way it's all done. So you don't have to remember to donate on Give NOLA Day. And we're also posting that link in the chat. Thank you all again for all of the work that you do in community with us and with renters across the state. Thank you for your commitment to housing justice. And I hope you have a good night.